Good evening, everyone. Сегодня мы будем говорить на английском языке. Добро пожаловать на публичную программу «Резиденция ландшафт как монумент». Welcome to the public program of Landscape as a Monument AIR program. It's the third event of public program, and today with us we have Jessica Zychowicz, researcher and artist historian from US, and today we will have a Q&A session after this, after her talk, and we will discuss with our residents the key questions which related to her talk today, and it's I would say that it's the last event of public program, and we already finished the online residency, which kindly supported by Ukrainian Culture Foundation, and it's this event happened like afterward of the residency program. Jessica Zychowicz was recently US Fulbright scholar to Ukraine, and she's co-author of Superfluous Woman, Feminism, Art and Revolution in 21st Century in Ukraine. She's currently postdoctoral scholar at the University of Alberta. And her interests also methodology of social sciences and her interest is also Ukrainian art today, feminism, different topics related to this problematics. And today with us we have many of the participants of the program, which mostly artists from art professionals, curators, researchers, mostly people from art. And I will give you, Jessica, I will give you a word, but maybe we can start with a short introduction, why we're interested in this talk, and which maybe questions we have to methods in artistic research, or we can start with your presentation. It's up to you. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dmitry, for that lovely overview of all of the wonderful things that you guys have been doing. I would love to hear more from anyone who's willing to share and have a dialogue before diving into my presentation. I am currently in the US. I also have enjoyed some support from Canada, and I'm working as an academic, as a researcher at University of Alberta, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. My interest in Ukraine goes back to 2005, right after the Orange Revolution, when I went to Ukraine as a volunteer English language teacher for 2 years through the Peace Corps program. And I was living in Sambyr in West Ukraine, about 40 minutes outside of Lviv. I probably don't need to say that for our Ukrainian participants who know where Lviv and Sambyr are, but these places now, have really been put on the map. And over time, over the past 15 years of studying and researching Ukraine, learning the language, learning about the art there, I have really enjoyed being in dialogue with artists from Izolatsia and also other groups like VCRC in Kiev and Open Group in Lviv. And I've noticed, as political changes happen in the country, from the Orange Revolution to Maidan Revolution to, the war, the annexation of Crimea, all of these changes have an impact. Oops, sorry. I'll turn my phone off. All of these things have an impact in art and in culture. And the word impact itself is kind of awkward term. What does that really mean? I don't think it's the role of an artist to change necessarily a population or a group, or to take the role of a politician. And that's a debate that artists and scholars are always engaging around, how much to be nonconformist art or socially engaged art. Ukraine, in particular, for me, has been an incredible context for asking these questions, because there is history, of violence towards art and artists that in the 1920s ended with very tragic, assassination of many cultural figures because of their talent. And that kind of persecution of individuals and artists is happening at different times and places in varying degrees of frequency around the world. So I'm today going to take a look at 4 different artists with our audience from the US context. These are some of my favorite artists who have inspired me to engage theoretical questions and work with text, because I'm a writer. I don't know how to paint. I haven't tried, but I paint with words, and I think our writing as scholars can be an extension of art, and can sometimes be more performative. You can draw out different elements of the image, and the image can draw out elements of the text, that these things work and integrate one and the other. Some of the theorists that I'll talk about and that have really influenced my thinking and my work are familiar to you, like Susan Sontag. Others may be less, like Ariella, Azoulay, but I will include, and into my PowerPoint, I've included a list of references. So if you're interested in following up on your own and reading some of these texts, you will have a list there. And please feel free to contact me with any questions or other, follow-up ways of engaging that would interest you, because I know it is the last week of summer, and talking about violence in art is not the most uplifting always. And many of you, I'm sure, have on your mind grant applications or even job applications. So I will be, trying my best also to create concepts or ways of engaging with this material that is useful to you, that you might integrate into your applications. I know you're working on proposals. All the residents are working on proposals for ways to further their work through small grants. And if you guys have any questions on that process too, feel free to reach out on my email, because being an academic, we have to write so many grants too. And any kind of help that I can give to you to work on these kinds of materials, if you're choosing to think about social violence in the landscape in which your project might evolve, then I can help you to develop those parts of your work and your applications. So that being said, I would love to hear from anyone who's willing to share their ideas or what they're working on, and then we can move to my presentation as Dimitri sees fit with the timeline that we're working on today.
Well, maybe we can start with Simona or Alina or Maxim. I don't know. They're with us, and guys, are you ready to join? Well, I would say
Okay.
that. I would say that we have many project ideas about Eastern Ukraine, and this ethnographical methods and approaches now in online becomes more important, and maybe you can comment somehow this. Comment on this situation with archives and digitalization, how situation changed during last maybe half a year with this in in the universities, and especially how to work in this new reality with archiving. And as I know, many of trips and travels which connected with some academic research, for example, which Izolatia organized or facilitated for some researchers or artists, they were cancelled, and digitalization is now maybe becomes more important for each of us. And how this situation changed, I mean, in your in your case.
Yeah, the situation around travel for us at University of Alberta was already starting to change before coronavirus, because there were a lot of efforts to reduce the carbon footprint actually of travel for conferences, because one seat on an airplane round trip from Alberta to New York, is I think something like 10 square cubic meters of carbon dioxide. So the outcome, the silver lining here could really be that we are making a concerted effort now that will have lasting impacts on the landscape and the environment, that can favor better ecological practices. Certainly, the losses of social engagement and interaction in our professional fields are to be taken into account as well. But we, are all working with new platforms of documenting and organizing information. And I'm really hopeful that we might see more interesting patterns emerge as we line up our, images with maybe more local ideas, or to just kind of create new cross-pollinizations between different departments that might not otherwise work together, but need to kind of draw together now to deal with scarce resources. Alberta being, the sort of world's capital of oil and gas production outside of Texas, in the Western Hemisphere, we have very interesting ecological movements there, and environmental work being done in the academic context, such as it's called Oil Futures Project at University of Alberta, which brought together actually a lot of artists with scientists, biologists, and computer scientists, data imaging. All these different interdisciplinary kind of projects have been emerging around the or outside of the oil industry in order to critique it, in order to what is called trigger a post-oil future. If you go to the Oil Futures website at University of Alberta, you can download a free PDF copy of their book, in which there are several artist statements as well about how they are creatively showing alternative futures to the addiction to oil that our societies have. So, long story short, I think that the coronavirus, while it is a terrible and a really harrowing disease that has caused so much trauma in so many families, it is something we have to live with, and I think we're going to have to live with it for a long time, even after the vaccine is found. And we need to narrate to ourselves and our audiences the positive things that we are doing, and the gain we can have here. And I think that the ecological crisis underpinning all of this is something that we should, working with landscape as monument especially, that we can be on the avant-garde of exposing for audiences. So that's where I would focus a lot of energy, a lot of attention, more in going in that direction with my work. That's what I would be that's what I'm interested in engaging with, also with this community and what you guys are already working on, because you have so much local material that is really unique for people who cannot travel to Donbass. It's difficult to get to Donbass from for many people. And I think that, this is also building on last year's Donbass Studies summer school, which looked a lot at the historical dimensions of deindustrialization. And we are now in like another wave of deindustrialization as we move online, as we go to this, I would say even technocratic future that we can, pull on in also the kinds of social injustices that become built into questions of human-computer interaction, and the materials future of access to technology that not all populations have. So there are those social dimensions to consider as well, in how the social ecology is, uneven. It's incredibly uneven, and income gaps are something that is interesting also to look at in different contexts and different places. And something I appreciated a lot about the Donbass Studies summer school that I was able to attend in person last year. I wanted to be there this year in person, but because of the travel restrictions, I couldn't. I really appreciated the inclusion of local academics who were lecturing about the history of the mines, and the field trips that we were able to take to the sites of mining, and also of different cultural initiatives that already exist in Donbass, so that we're engaging what's already there in the landscape and the social landscape as well, that is integrated in this part of the ecological structure of Donbass.
Thank you for these issues with mobility and environmental issues. Well, yeah, we will try to work next month is more with specific concrete places, and we hope that artists will go to also to different locations for doing their projects. As I see in comments, our participants mentioned that they're not ready with the questions. Maybe let's have your presentation, and then we can discuss some questions and to have Q&A. Yeah.
Sure, that sounds great. I will share my screen. So here's my title: Framework, Ethnographic Method for Visual Research. This title, Framework, was originally going to be the title of my book, but I changed it to Superfluous Women, which I explain in the introduction of my book. And that book really traces the years 2009 all the way to 2015 in Ukrainian art and culture, looking a lot at feminism and gender. So it's a bit of a sarcastic title, Superfluous Women. Superfluous meaning something you don't need, you throw it away, but it's also a reference to the superfluous man of the late 19th century, which was a character prototype in Dostoevsky, but building on Turgenev. They were debating a generation and its usefulness to society. I will not summarize that introduction here. If any of our audience members are interested in reading my book, I would love to engage interested voices, and I can help you get a copy of it that is not going to break your bank account, because honestly, I cannot even afford to buy my own book if I wanted to. It's too expensive because it's the institutional price right now, which is for the librarians, not for you. But if you want to read it, I will make sure it happens. So email me. But ethnographic method is, this way of writing or making images that we might confuse with the documentary method, or someone might call it like a scientific description of an event or a population. I use this idea here as a technique for tracing society in change and tracing conflict. And also, I think that this way of what is called thick description, and let's see, I'm trying to change my slide. Here we go. This method of ethnographic research being called often thick description, which is the technique of describing something without trying to explain it. You don't want to put qualifiers into the text. You are simply capturing what is around you. This way of writing is, I think, a very productive and a very ethically responsible way of representing violence or political change or war. And I chose to focus on this today because I know that Donbass is on the front line of the conflict with Russia, and the populations, the people there who we spoke with last summer, were very generous in sharing their experiences of occupation in Lugansk Oblast. And I felt that it was impossible for me to make a conclusion from those experiences, that rather just to record them or try to convey them or even work as a translator, translate them into English was enough. I have this quote here by Susan Sontag from an interview she did, which is available on YouTube, with John Berger called "To Tell a Story." And she says, "The reason you wanted to tell a story was because you were moved by him, by the person in your story. Do you feel some stories should be told more than other stories, and why?" I think this is a really great quote because it slows us down as authors, as artists, to ask ourselves from the very beginning where the idea emerges and why it is deserving of our attention and our time, and how the story, the character, the person in the story, later in this interview, she says, is both the beginning and the end of the story. That, something that drives your narrative doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious observation. That a lot of the times our narratives emerge and they move forward on their own through observation, and that this is a good quote for ethnographic work, because you are describing, and then later when you go back and return to your sketches or your notes, you can see a kind of pattern emerging, and that pattern is oftentimes a mirror of your own experiences. So that's building into another term here from anthropology, which is self-reflexivity. I started my story today with all of you telling you a little bit about how I became interested in Ukraine and going there in 2005. And today I will continue also to include things about myself, because what is the curatorial or the selection process that is happening on maybe the conscious and also unconscious level is part of the writing process that we are using when we're engaging with societies, places that are also completely unfamiliar to us. And when you're dealing with the really inexplicable tragedies of violence or war, you have to kind of surrender control to the text. This image here is called from a film called Dark Days, which is by Mark Singer and DJ Shadow. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with DJ Shadow, but he is a musician and also a visual artist. He's done a lot of graffiti work in New York City, and this film was about people, like a huge group of people, maybe 100 people, who live in the New York subway, in one section of the New York subway, because it's a giant jungle down there. There are like 10 layers. The subway goes really deep. And they basically have created a whole parallel city underneath New York. And the film is in black and white. And the images are oftentimes in this style of like early 20th century documentary photography. There's not a lot of editing. There's not a lot of excess detail. Nothing is staged. It's all spontaneous. I included some clips, so I will leave these in the presentation, and you guys can watch them at will. One of them is 10 minutes long. The other one, I'll see if I can play here. I don't know if the music will come through, but I just wanted to give you a quick snippet of DJ Shadow's music, which combines elements from contemporary hip hop and early jazz and blues. So he is like working with these layers of history in the music accompanying the documentary. And the documentary also includes a lot of discussion and people talking about the spaces in which they're in. So I wanted to show you a quick piece here. We have two individuals who are living under the subway, and they're going to talk to each other about their landscape. So I'm just going to play the last minute or so here.
Actually, I can hear. Yeah, the video.
Oh, you can't hear it.
Yeah, we can't. Maybe.
Okay, I will summarize it, and then I will forward this PowerPoint to Dmitry, and he can provide it to participants over email if you guys would like to take a look later. But what's happening in this sequence is there are two people who are sharing the same space in the subway, and they're talking about the yeah?
Maybe it's possible also to share this in this chat, in this Zoom group chat.
Yeah, yes, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. It will just give me the link. I can paste it. Let's see.
Well, I can find it and share with others.
Okay.
Yeah, don't stop.
That's great. That's great. We can revisit this clip at the end. Mm-hmm. The takeaway I wanted to point to here, though, is that a lot of the interactions between individuals living in this parallel city do not parallel the violence of New York above ground. And DJ Shadow shows a lot of interactions between African Americans and white Americans living down here who are talking to each other as, old married couples would talk to each other. In this clip, he's brushing his teeth and the other man is saying, oh, the dog is always making a mess, and we used to have to take our shoes off in here. Now we can keep our shoes on. There's this way of interaction, there's this dialogue and exchanges that are happening in this parallel city that don't match the context that one might expect. They challenge this context. The images and the dialogue is not scripted at all. It's simply documented by recording it and framing it in a very minimalist way without a lot of intervention. But it does surprise the audience because it's selected. The selection is clear as you watch the film. The sequences are very edited, so they change quite a bit one from the other. And I know that Dovzhenko in Kiev, actually, in his early work on propaganda films, he was making more large scale films. He's developing some of this early editing technique where you move from one scene to the other and the scenes comment on one another by their sequence. So in ethnographic writing, nothing is ever a purely recorded event that is reality as it exists. Everything is mediated by the author, even if you're not always aware of it. But in building the story, the form becomes the story. And in this case, the form of dialogue between Blacks and whites underneath New York in 2000, which was right before 9/11 hit the city, where there were a lot of racial tensions already because of recession and a lot of other events in American society. There was this underground world that people would relegate to something superfluous, something non-existing, something unimportant, but actually you can see it's filled with a life of its own, and it returns agency to this way of depicting or writing an ethnography. It really returns agency to the speakers. It lets the voices of the people in the photos speak for themselves, come through, rather than making a scientific conclusion, taking a survey, giving people a set of questions to answer and then mapping them as data. That's a different kind of project and than what creative work can do, and what artists and ethnographers, anthropologists have in common really is this drive to bring the agency, I think, of the voice as it is in situ forward. I can't make a generalization that all artists or all anthropologists want to create some kind of portrait, because the landscape is also an extension of the characters in the portrait. And you will see in the film, if you do watch the longer film, that trains become really important and become kind of an extension of the communities within them, as a metaphor as well as an allegory for the nation above, an allegory for the city of New York, an allegory for the nation of America, and the metaphor of the train moving through the city. That nothing is stable in this film. It's really interesting, and I hope that you will take time to look at it. Let's see, I want to go, here we go. So what I'm describing is not completely my own idea here. I can't take full credit. I'm citing Emile Durkheim, who is a foundational thinker in sociology and looking at the individual versus the group, appearing in an allegory of the relationship between the individual and society, between private and public space, and different constructions of individuality. I know that's a lot of words at once, so I will break this down for you, this main idea, through images and text. These two photos look like they could just be, nondescript iPhone photos that you would delete on your phone. Maybe they were taken by accident while you were ordering a kebab. These images could be almost anywhere in the world. You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you that they were part of a show in the New York MoMA, which they were. And why would they be part of a show? And well, we'll get to that. But the location of New York being a central theme of today's presentation, brings us to this idea of center and periphery. The location of culture is the title of a book by Homi Bhabha, who is a cultural theorist, very famous one. And he's writing about time and place and culture. And I think anytime we're dealing with landscape, we're always dealing with place, obviously, but we're also dealing with time and how we perceive the relationship between the concept of time, which he says here, and the aesthetic form or artistic practices. So today's patterns of culture can challenge our older, maybe more established assumptions about chronology and developments in time. Here, we'll return us again to this series of nondescript, very general photos of non-places. You know, these offices and the kebab stand, they seem like, you know, non-places. There's nothing very definitive about them, unless we give them some context, and the context for these photos is an artist, Emile Yassir, and she named the series Ramallah, New York, 2004 to 2005. These years were really important in terms of what we're thinking about time and place. It changes now our view of the landscape of New York in these photos, because we see, okay, this is the post-11 era. This was when a lot of the Muslim communities in the United States were facing discrimination. They were facing marginalization in many cases. And we are seeing, you know, family businesses, perhaps local stores, but we're also looking at these particular photos here through the images of a security camera. So we see in a security camera, a Muslim family, a young girl. Why would we see these photos like this? Because I think the artist is trying to draw our attention, for an American audience's attention, these were displayed in New York, to this idea of, you know, surveillance of an innocent citizen, of projecting fear onto population based on events that maybe were out of the individual's control. So we might look at this, you know, his shirt almost has like a sheriff's badge on it. We could think of this as a police photo in a, you know, crime scene, or we could see it as simply a small business owner, which is almost a hero in American society. So the artist is really playing with our senses, and then if we go back to the other photos, we begin to see some of the details come through. Like there is a calendar here of you know, Muslim holidays tacked over a KLM calendar, and KLM being an airline company. You know, we're again in this post 9/11 world with, you know, the airlines, and this could be inside the Twin Towers. Like she's played with all of these fears underlying American culture in the early 2000s, and she's humanized them in a way and also made them seem kind of ridiculous and out of context. This is my small little comment about Yassir and her subject, that it's really less about the specificities of place and landscape than about how immigrants, refugees, and newcomers to a nation or a group from all walks of life recreate the patterns of their home cultures, familiar from photographs, films, and so forth, in new geographic locations. So the landscape can be remade anywhere. That home is kind of what you take with you. It's an imagined thing, but it's also a created thing that defines, you know, parameters of belonging. And those parameters, I think, in her work are controlled by the individual, that it's this belonging, this right to the city, right to be part of New York City, right to be part of America, and not to be defined by you know, one historical event that, you know, can become like a dictated chronology of who belongs, who doesn't belong. so she's one of my favorite artists. Back to Durkheim, just some terminology that might help you think about some concepts in your own work in a new or interesting way. I won't overwhelm you too much. I'll let you guys look through these slides at your own will. But Durkheim is looking at society from a large scale perspective, looking at structures that make up a society and how each part keeps the society stable. Moving towards functionalism, society is headed toward equilibrium. So ways of thinking and acting that existed before one individual, they will still exist after one individual exits the society. So this way of thinking about structures is very different than traditionalism. Functionalism is different because in traditionalism, the idea is that you preserve a tradition and you continue it, and that is what makes a society stable. Here we're dealing with something else, social facts. Having this coercive effect in his Emile Durkheim's work over the individual that is only used and noticed when we resist against them. So moral regulating aspects of a society in Emile Durkheim's theory are law and religion not being the same, and these are manifest functions in society versus latent functions that you don't see as clearly, that are not written down and given to you and saying, this is the law. Of course, we are all Americans. We are all equal. We all belong. We have this constitution. These are the manifest functions. But the latent functions are the social structures that challenge that or we resist, where it's not always clear how the manifest functions will then later change. The difference is that manifested functions coordinate interdependencies between the structures, and the latent functions can have unintended consequences that are indirect effects on institutions. So this is the theory that, equilibrium and the interlocking integrated structures of society, they are controlled and, manifest, and they are on one level, but then the latent functions, these social facts, these ways of being, that they can become, cemented, and they can be harmful actually, or they can open up and these can be sites of resistance. And making those latent functions visible, I think, which I'll give you another example of a really wonderful artist, my favorite artist of all American art of all time, other than Edward Hopper. These are really, sites of justice making in documentary film, in photography, in ethnographic writing, because you can really use your voice to translate and create visibility around these social facts that marginalize people, or you can be more inclusive. So in Durkheim's central question, he was asking, what holds a society together? How can it remain relatively stable even when traditions disappear or customs change? And Emily was writing, a change in production, distribution, coordination will force others to adapt in order to maintain a stable state society. So the question is, what's the main problem in Durkheim's theory of functionalism? And the main problem is functionalism cannot explain social change or conflict, cannot explain war. Why? Well, many reasons, and a few that scholars have debated on in more recent contemporary work is the idea of the shrinking city, where exchange value and use value increases but property value is less definitive, or inhabitation, which is more of what we're looking at today in my examples, which is that there are political acts rather than geographic conditions that determine the different direction and pressures in society. And some have written about, like Richard Florida in the US context, the creative class, which is a generator of income and of GDP and GNP, but it can also lead to issues of gentrification or disparity within communities. And then there's alternative uses of the city, new commons, everyday urbanism versus unreal estate. I know urbanism and urbanist is a term I often encounter in Ukraine, and I'm sure many of you can run circles around me with all of the theory and writing that has been done on urban landscapes. But I won't dwell on that today. I just wanted to point out that Emile Durkheim's work was kind of a long time ago, but very important and foundational to this line of thinking about the public spaces, private spaces, and inclusion and making visible processes of inclusion. Sontag and Roland Barthes viewed the meaning of the photographic image in the photographer's hands, that they really located the site of meaning making in the artist and the photographer's hands. Whereas more recent critiques, especially by Ariella Azoulay, whose work I follow quite closely, they focus more on this idea, the civil contract between the photographer and the person in the photo, or the subject in the photo, whether it's a person or nature, landscape, that this shifts our focus to the ethics of the viewer and the reception and the exchange, both material and symbolic, on which the artwork is moving. So this all folds into a wonderful and interesting emerging field of critique and writing by artists and authors that Ariella Azoulay kind of opened up with her idea of civil imagination. And Misha Minokov, in the Ukrainian contexts, he also, I know as a photographer, he uses the word political creativity, that this imagination and creativity belongs in the, quote unquote, scientific field of social sciences, that we can unfold from an ontology of the photograph, or also the artwork, a more nuanced set of social relations. And this is, I think, the beginning of a landscape's direction it's going to move in, that, our social relations are determining the landscape as much as the landscape is determining us. And there's an ontology, the site on which the image is located is changing. It's not fixed. So I like that idea as we look at images of violence that challenge us to really think about our own place in time and history. This is an artist, Kara Walker, whose works have been exhibited quite a bit in New York again, but she is originally from California. She was born in 1969. She is a silhouettist, printmaker, installation artist, and a filmmaker who explores race, gender, sexuality, violence, identity in her work. This image here is an example of what she's best known for, which are her room-size tableaus. I just want to give you a sense of the size of this. See, this would take up a whole gallery wall. This one was exhibited in London. And these images, they are cutouts. I thought they would be interesting for us to look at because in ways they do kind of remind me of Ukrainian woodcuts. But what they're actually drawing upon in terms of aesthetic form is the phenomenon of the 19th century slave plantation owner's home, in which there were oftentimes elaborate wallpaper installations, that this would be maybe a landscape of flowers or local swamps and trees that would be painted inside of a slave owner's home in a room that he or she would entertain guests in and serve elaborate meals and have big parties. But if we look closely at Kara Walker's adaptation of this form to her own work, her own ideas, we can see built into the storyline, the narrative in the image, very violent scenes of, like incest maybe, or rape. This is a clearer image of what I'm talking about. You can see here, you know, young, maybe slave children being mistreated, and the silhouettes are showing almost like a haunting of what was happening on the plantations in the late 19th century. Her titles are always very evocative, like this title, Slaughter of the Innocents. They might be guilty of something. You know, she's really drawing attention through irony to the uncovering and of the brutality of the African-American experience. In that being said, you know, you can see here some depictions of folk tales, early American folk tales. Sometimes you'll see like the idea of maybe a hero, you know, a Confederate flag will appear in her work sometimes, and she's not shying away from the stereotypes either of African Americans, like the Sambo figure. She's using them in a sarcastic way. Of course, she, you know, is not advocating for this, and you are really encouraged to be kind of looking closely by her titles. Again, Go to Hell or Atlanta, whichever comes first. So she's showing us the contemporaneousness also of the violence that people are experiencing. And I have included this. You know, right now, my own place in history is I am an American who is of non-African American background. I have Polish descent, and I had really interesting experiences in college working with an African American professor in a course about African American blues music through hip hop, because I was working at a record shop called Rasputin Records, of all things, in San Francisco, and I became really interested and involved in the hip hop music scene on the West Coast at that time, which in the early 2000s was filled with wonderful poetry. A lot of singers were like Jurassic 5, Black Eyed Peas. They were bringing to their songs lyrics about the Iraq War, lyrics about 9/11, lyrics about racism and police brutality. And it seems that that time is again, you know, with us in the Black Lives Matter movement. So I wanted to draw attention today to my own context and to social injustice in my own country. So that's why I really wanted to share Kara Walker, because her works, I think, really speak to current struggles. And her entire, you know, collection of works have been displayed not only in the US, but also in London and the Venice Biennale. Here again, we see this amazing sort of woodcut form that I recognize from, you know, early Ukrainian folk culture. And I think also the, you know, paper here, paper cutouts of the palm trees, the self-portrait. This is called Gone. It's really interesting because she's coding these. And I remember seeing in a recent exhibit that I helped to bring support and attention to in Canada, which was recently at Bosaredok Canadian Ukrainian Museum. It was called On the Front Line, and Izolatsa actually was part of that, supporting that exhibit. There was a woodcut like this in the exhibit, and it had images from the Soviet experience, like put into the woodcut. So it was using readapting the Ukrainian folk form to, you know, trouble or question this idea of a linear chronology, like going back to Homi Bhabha, the location of culture not being in the past or the present, but that some of our experiences, if we can connect with older generations and look at them continuously, we might see in a different way. So also I wanted to include these images because we're working with the idea of landscape as monument. And this one here is also made of paper. These were part of the series Gone, which Carol Walker later used actually to create an opera about the African-American experience for the Venice Biennale in 2016. This almost looks like a mask, could be like even a death mask laying on the ground like this. But here she's rendered it into a landscape in which, I don't know if you can see over here, there are these red figures walking in the landscape. They could be ghosts, they could be slaves, but the depiction, the rendering of the landscape is very allegorical here for slavery, and also the land, working the land being this sort of, the underlying element of the inhumanity, almost like a witness. The land could be viewed as a witness to the inhumanity, but a witness that maybe cannot speak in a language, a human language, but maybe is better conveyed through image, because the ambiguity of the language of a landscape can be conveyed in a more ambiguous way using images rather than using human languages. Again, here I think that point comes through clearly in this landscape piece of hers. Here's a little bit about her work in her own words. She writes, "The last century witnessed 2 world wars and more than 1 genocide. The present century opened on famines and a string of national disasters. The work that has grown out of these experiences, motivated by a sense of urgency in order to resist erasure, communicate the speed of change, and ensure memory in the physical world, moving freely between history and memory, photographic and moving images, or incorporating artifacts and mementos. Sometimes silence takes on, and the loss can be experienced and expressed only as absence." So this idea, also of absence in language, what language cannot capture, has been eloquently written about by Julia Kristeva in describing, the inability, really, the working through of violence through words that do not, capture violence and are not captured by it, but simply trace around an absence. Another landscape piece by Carol Walker, "Dredging the Quagmire, Bottomless Pit," from New York, 2017. Again, she's really placing the narrative into the landscape, and if we look closely, we can try and defer different events that may have happened, or what this figure here perhaps looks like a perpetrator, but that's also something significant in her work, that it's not always clear who's a perpetrator and who is a victim. Like in this case, it's not quite clear who this figure is, if it's a perpetrator or a victim, and that's often how it is in lived experiences of violent conflict and violent cycles. So the form here too is also connected to other experiences in the American experience. So this could be slavery. It could also be a Jewish man. It could be, a reference to Guernica, from Picasso's Guernica, with this bulb here. So I'll let you guys look through these on your own, but this also has elements of the Iraq War. You see the year was 2017, but she's talking about a slave market. So she's using different eras and layering them to make critiques about the present. And the most interesting, I think, piece of hers right now is this Caravan Catastrophe. Is a Haitian Creole word that means catastrophe, and this was a site-specific installation in New Orleans, not far from the former market where slaves were traded. But the fact she's using the word caravan in 2019 is significant, because in US media, this was the word connected to President Trump's anti-immigration policies. So the allegory of slavery here, she extends out not only from her own experience, African-American history, but to others' experiences around the world today in coming to the US. And here, the last piece of hers I will share with you, I thought would be interesting for Izolatio because it was installed in a large factory, and it was made of sugar, which sugar being the product that was produced, through the slave labor of sugarcane harvesting in the American South. This becomes interesting because it's also, been installed in the Domino sugar refining plant, which has since been destroyed. And it was created with this group called Creative Time, which I would encourage you guys to go to their website and read about them. They started in the 1970s and have done many, many, many projects on huge landscape projects, and not only factories, not only urban landscapes, but also rural landscapes. And they have supported many, many artists. Could be an inspiration just to read up on their history. Last piece, I guess I don't really have time to talk about that one, but I will end with this quote by Piotr Piotrowski on agoraphilia, this fetishization of the public square, which he wrote about in terms of the East European context and this shift from post-war to post-communism. That might be too much to add here today because we don't have a lot of time, but I have my references here. These are just some of the things that I referred to if you're interested in having a look, and my email address as well.
Thank you, Jessica. I will check. Do we have questions in our Facebook? Vitaly, we hear you. Microphone, please mute. Yeah. Well, if nobody have a question, I have a question to maybe general question for researchers and artists about public engagement. Well, always when we start different collaborations or different research, we need to involve people, and maybe I'm interested how we can recognize the voices of ordinary members of local community and incorporate this into the discourses and activities that emerge maybe in the course of public engagement, and especially when we talk about, well, let's say a region with a hard memory or hard heritage or hard legacy. Now we have the industrialization in Donbass, and well, it's always questioned how to build this cooperation with local community, with local historians. You mentioned in the beginning of your talk that you was inspired by this conversation with Lysychansk local historians, and I mean how to build this not I mean in fruitful way for both sides. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's also a question to methods.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, that's a tough question. I think the beginning is to ask that question and to continue asking it, that it never can really be solved. It's always something to return to. I think one of the most effective ways of engaging a community is to return to the community many times and not expect to be able to enter with a plan that you're going to check all these boxes and then you're going to, you know, get an A+, that the community members will lead you oftentimes in the directions that they know are most fruitful for them. And if they're open to collaboration with you, then they will, you know, develop, co-create a project. But if they're not open, I mean, there are also moments when you have to just end a project sometimes because you don't want to like force something that's not working. There can be productive moments of conflict and negotiation where you need to like stand firm on some things that you aren't going to change, but there are also times when you need to reevaluate and, you know, readjust. In writing grants, it's often difficult because you need to like present a project as though it's completed almost, yet you have not researched it yet. You don't really know how the final shape of the work is going to turn out, but you need to describe for the grant committee how you envision it. And that is why I think like the best proposals take a long time, and the best projects, you know, take years sometimes before they will evolve in a way that truly does engage a community. But that's not to say that you should think, oh my gosh, every project now should take at least 5 years, because some of the best things can be spontaneous and just develop out of nothing. And that being said, I think you've got to be really patient when you're doing ethnographic work. A lot of it is just waiting and not knowing what's going to be around the corner, and just maybe spending a lot of time in one place that you wouldn't normally go to, and noting down, you know, everyday activities. It can be really banal, but then you'll have like an illumination after you get out of that context and return to wherever you were before. You'll then start to see like what you actually have learned and what's been shared with you. And in that sense too, I didn't get into it too much today because I think it deserves an entire separate discussion, which is about ethics, the ethics of the researcher. There are a lot of, you know, protocols within academia on how to ethically engage a community and how to protect your sources, especially when you're dealing with traumatized communities or you know, individuals who have experienced violence. And that is something that is important, I think, if you're a teacher, to share early on with your students, that there's a high level of responsibility that you have to really, you know, always be aware of. So all of those things, you know, really shape a project and how it ends up in the end. But it's so enriching and wonderful when you do have those moments of breakthrough where you really feel like you've been changed as a person. And I keep coming back to Ukraine. It's been 15 years, guys. It's been 15 years. And I just keep coming back to Ukraine. And I don't know. I mean, I've been changed by what I encounter and what people share with me. And yeah, it's a learning. You have to just love to learn. You have to fall in love with it. It's the only thing. I mean, this is not, ethnographic work is not something people calculate on paper, and it's different than, it's not finance, it's not, you know, mathematics. So oh, I can't hear you.
It's interesting that academia and universities has their own commissions of ethics, which overview the projects and give you this opportunity to interview people, and we haven't it in artistic projects. Do we need the similar commissions and art projects in these topics? Well, it's open question. I see that Simona have a question. Maybe you can join us with video and join the discussion. I don't know.
Yeah, I can do so. I mean, so I was more as I'm looking also into Donbass area and this post-industrial society and also post-industrial urban setting. I was interested in relation to your work. How might this physical absence of people, well, in this case due to the a failure of industry, or in some areas post-war situation, or pandemic like today in many places. So how can this absence of people change the narrative of landscape and our cultural or virtual or visual references?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Something I should mention is that when I was doing my graduate work, I was at University of Michigan, which is near Detroit, right next to Detroit, and a lot of my relatives are from the Detroit area, and I had the great privilege of spending time in the city and moving through, seeing a lot of the abandoned buildings, but also experiencing conversations with artists and activists in Detroit who were making photographs of those cities. And one of the debates that emerged around that time, it was, I think, 2011, was this term that Kalle Lasson of Adbusters, who was instrumental, he was important in the Occupy Wall Street movement, he termed ruin porn. He said that a lot of the photographers who were coming to Detroit would come, take a picture, leave, publish it in Paris, and that it was like a pornography of ruin, that they didn't really invest in the city's communities. They didn't really learn about the city because they weren't writing anything interesting next to their photographs. They were writing them almost as like voyeurism. And I think that, you know, in the text that accompanies the photographs, the context, the framing of a space without people in it can move, I think, more quickly into the space of voyeurism, because the viewer puts themselves into the photo, and they can do that in a way that is, you know, completely fantastic and ignores the actual lived reality of that space. But when you have people or you have characters in the photo, I think you kind of, you know, you shift outside of that frame a little bit faster. But then, you know, it's all about the framing and the curation and selection. And all of these things kind of inform each other on different levels. So I think that the landscape, you know, that's looking at the worst case scenario where a landscape without people becomes voyeuristic, but I think it can also move in the opposite direction, definitely. And it has, like in a lot of the images I've seen coming out of your guys' summer school, you're showing the great beauty in these, you know, ideas of ruin in the post-industrial landscape. Like I've seen beautiful, beautiful images from my context of Detroit that just don't even, you know, begin to scratch the surface of all the like ways that this sort of, you know, ruin of a whole society, of like a Greek, you know, industrial society was and is in itself a story that trying to restore the ruin is not maybe even interesting, that actually just accepting it for what it is and seeing it and moving in that direction is very powerful. And yeah, and then that being said, you know, I don't want to assume that for the actual lived experience, when you don't have electricity, when you know, are living around mice and rodents, like a ruin is not beautiful. It sucks. It's hard to live in. And those activists in Detroit that are still like, working with different initiatives to draw attention to the buildings, they play with that idea. There was a project called the Heidegger Project. Heidelberg, not Heidegger, Heidelberg Project. You can look it up online. It's not active anymore. It's still there, but it's not kept up. What artists were doing were they were taking a lot of things out of the abandoned buildings, painting them, and also attaching them to the outsides of the structures to attract tourists and to show them like kind of how ridiculous it is to come looking for a ruin. But the, stuffed animals, for example, in one house was just covered with teddy bears, like painted pink. And people were saying also that these stuffed animals, they were standing in for the people that were absent from the environment, that they were allegories for the people, so that in the future photographers could come and take pictures of the pink teddy bears. So it was a way of, I think, reclaiming agency over the space that people felt belonged to them, that ruins are not absent always, like these are inhabited spaces, but if you're working with uninhabited spaces, I think your questions become really different. I'm just thinking of that context, but thank you, yeah.
I see the reaction of Vitaly Yankovoi. He was a participant of Ruins seminar, Theorizing Ruins seminar, and actually it's interesting question how some post-industrial regions becomes and maybe signed appropriate by artists, and maybe it's something which interesting phenomenon which happened with Donbass when many of artists interested in maybe projects, initiatives here, but actually Donbass region, maybe Donbass cities haven't institutions for that, and it's always speculative. It's always about imaginary art centers, imaginary galleries, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Ali, would you like to comment on Ruins? We haven't questioned in our Facebook stream, and we have with us Irina and Mark, which join us via link from this registration form. Maybe you to join. Yeah.
Hello. Nice to see all of you. And my question to Jessica, while I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about my own project and how can I use your methodology for the benefit of my research. And I was thinking, how should we work, for example, with your ideas, how to analyze different landscapes when we are studying like examples and cases of Ukrainian famine, for example, when this landscape had already been changed or destroyed, or just a lot of years had already been since then. So what would you recommend, and is it possible to adapt your ideas to that?
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, and yeah, this is a great intersection of work on material culture and landscapes. Landscapes being, a word that can also describe the built environment, architecture, or the natural environment, and these are two very different things. And I think in the Ukrainian context, the built environment has shown us since the Maidan revolution of 2014, a lot of debate around the idea of decommunization and ownership of different spaces, and the work, of UNESCO being limited in having jurisdiction over Soviet architecture, I think is something that we can consider. And think about, why or why not, like a lot of these buildings had quite a bit of artistic merit to them, and that sometimes our ideological or reactions around current events can lead to endangering or destroying actually some of the sites that have themselves the marks of unfair treatment of artists. Destroying a statue by an artist who was persecuted by the regime just because the statue is a monument to the regime. It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's destroying the legacy of the artist who, maybe or maybe not conformed completely to the state. So I think that in this context, in the context of Ukraine right now, it's an extremely important question, the landscape as monument, and the idea of a monument in the wake of the Lenin falls and all of this. It's extremely critical now that artists are taking this debate on. And in the concepts that I'm working with, a lot of them that I was showing today can be looked at in different contexts. I really like comparative work because it challenges regimes, it challenges states, and it challenges policymakers to really, think critically about the legacies they're creating or not creating. The opportunity cost also can be better viewed if we're comparing different contexts. What could have been done differently, or how can we move forward in a way that opens up spaces for education? What I would love, what I think is really great in Canada, where I am based and where you are, I know as well, in Edmonton, we should go together sometime to one of these artist-run spaces downtown. There are a lot of them, and they're really, working in a way where artists get to take responsibility for their own messages, and they have a lot of, work they're doing with curators and scholars too. More spaces like that are really grassroots would be exciting. I know Izolacja is doing tons of that, and DNAD is the curatorial group that works a lot in the Donbass region. But I think there's room for more, and also more international engagement, more people coming to learn from what is happening there. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Jessica.
Sure.
Well, maybe we can stop here for today, and if nobody have comments or questions, I suggest to end today, but maybe continue our conversation in different formats, and maybe with discuss concrete projects. And thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure to have talked with you, and see you maybe next open presentation of our residency events and artist talks. Keep safe, and have a good evening, or it's now morning in California anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and again, please reach out. I will send you these slides also, and let's be in touch. I look forward to seeing more of the posts from the school, following them actively.
Ciao.
Па-па. До побачення. Щасливого дня.